They made a market of it in Red Hollow. A woman stood on the raised planks of the auction block like a thing someone might barter for, a name called, a price raised, laughter like gravel. The sky above the town was the color of iron, and the men in the crowd wore the look of those who measure everything by what it can earn them. Victor Hale sat on the judge's bench as if the town were his pew, his face smooth with the entitlement of a man who had long stopped needing to hide his hunger. Ayanna was young enough to still have the quickness of a body that remembers how to run. She did not look like a thing. Her eyes, dark as river stones, kept scanning the crowd, finding edges and exits. There were rope marks at the wrists, bruises that freckled her shoulder like bad weather. A strip of cloth tied at the mouth had left its phantom along the skin where she'd been gagged. Someone in the crowd jeered a question about where she'd been taken from. Another laughed, and for a moment it felt as if every voice in Red Hollow was counting the cost of owning another's life. Caleb Rourke watched with a hand inside his coat, where the leather of the pouch rubbed against his hip. The bag of silver inside felt heavier with every insult thrown at the woman. He had not come to Red Hollow to buy anyone. He had come to drink and forget himself for a night, and possibly to slip further into the road, away from what he had been. The cavalry left marks that didn't heal, the scent of cordite on your hands weeks after you'd handled a rifle, the ghost pressure in your chest when you crossed a certain ridge. He had tried to outrun it. It had trailed him through desert and dust and the names of dead men he could still see when the moon tilted wrong. He had been counting the coins for months, adding and subtracting in bedrolls and saloons. There had been no noble plan, only a number he kept in his head that would buy something tangible and make the rest of the world feel steadier for the space of an hour. That number had sat like a slow fever in his pocket, until, on the auction plank, it became instead an answer. "Sold to the man with the worn coat," Hale called. The hammer fell as brisk as a winter gust, cutting through a canyon. Caleb stepped forward. The noise of the crowd dimmed to the dull roar of distant water. He felt the metal in his fist as he set the bag on the plank and let it fall open so everyone could see the coin singing into the rough wood. There was a silence, like a held breath. Then someone near the bench barked, "You can't just—" But the sound died in the space between Hale's smile and the silver's clink. Ayanna's shoulders went still, as if she was waiting to be taken away again, and Hale's hand drifted toward his pistol on the bench, as if to correct the order of things. The men around him stiffened like dogs at a whip's crack. Caleb said the words he had not expected to find. "She's free." He did not make a speech. He did not speak of justice or of payment for sin. He only picked up the woman when the next man reached, and when a booted hand closed toward her, Caleb's wrist found the heel of a knife in his coat and the edge of a voice that could still cut when he let it. Ayanna's face did not ask. It simply went with him because she had learned to go when mercy arrived, asking no questions. Hale's men did not move with pity. They moved with the certainty of property being taken. Shouts rose. A chair smashed. Someone in the crowd threw a bottle that cracked against the auction block and scattered like the future. Hale did not come down to stop them. Hale sat and watched, and that small gesture, an imperial shrug, made the whole town flood toward the exits like tidewater. They ran. Caleb had learned how to make himself small when a war was near. He had practiced retreat until it had become second nature, and now that old prudence braided itself with a new, stranger electricity. He shouldered Ayanna, who was light and frightened, and he felt in his hands the tremor of a man two things at once, terrified for himself and unwilling to let that fear decide another's fate. Outside the town, the scrub smelled of dust and sun. The road to his cabin was a ribbon of packed earth and thistle. Caleb had lived there a season, a place half built by guilt and half by the idea that there might be a last place he could hide. He pushed the cabin door open himself, hoping no town sheriff would be quick enough to follow. The shock of cold air inside the single room hit him like a slap. He dropped Ayanna on a narrow cot and swept his hand toward the small chest where he kept the rest of his silver, pieces he had saved for nothing more than the thought of it. He found, instead, Hale's man waiting at the threshold. The first bullet went through the thin wall like a verdict. The next found the floorboard beside his boot and lifted a moth of dust. Caleb moved the way he had in battle, bluntly, without art. He shoved Ayanna toward the back of the cabin and pressed his body into the door. The men outside cursed and tried the latch. Steps pounded like rain. A torch leaned against a post of the porch, then another. Flame licked the eaves as if the house had been a kindling promise. In the end, there was no clean retreat. The cabin burned black as a coal, and the wind carried the smoke back into Red Hollow as if the town wanted to taste its own cruelty. Caleb shouldered Ayanna out a back window that had been pried, and they dropped into the scrub with the sky brightening at the edge. The bag of silver had been left on the auction block. He had spent what he had on buying her, what he had been saving to do nothing, and even that the town would take. They fled into country not meant to be crossed at night. The cold bit their fingers, and the moon watched like an indifferent sheriff. Ayanna limped at first, but she found her balance. She moved like someone who had been taught to read the windline and the quiet ground. Once, in the dark, she whispered in a language Caleb did not know, and he heard a sound like a prayer or a curse, one syllable, low and private. He answered with a name he had not used in years, and felt the echo come back to him in the bones in his chest. They found, in the murk before dawn, a narrow canyon that tucked itself away from the world. There was a thin thread of water at its bottom and shelter carved by weather and time. Someone had made a place for themselves here, a circle of smoke-stained rock, a rope swing over a ledge, the quiet, enough to keep people breathing unnoticed. A figure stepped out from the mouth of a hut, an elder whose hair was a silver curtain and whose shoulders bore the kind of strength that had nothing to do with youth. Ayanna looked at them with the evenness of someone who had seen whole seasons of men come and go. The first thing she asked was not the what of their flight, but the why. When Caleb tried to answer, his voice felt foreign and stubby in his throat. He tried to offer the story of purchase and protest and fire, but Ayanna's mouth made no copy of his words. She listened in the way a landform listens, patient, noting erosion, measuring where footsteps had worn a path. "You bring trouble," she said to him in a language that cut out any pretense of courtesy. Her grandson, a broad young man called Dakota, stood half-hidden nearby. He watched Caleb the way a hawk watches a rabbit, impatient, untrusting. There was an oldness in his face, though, as if he had seen war's imprint already and had not chosen the softer road. He had a scar along his jaw like a remembered cut. Ayanna did not step back. She uncoupled a thin, weathered notebook from inside her shirt. The leather of it smelled of river mud and secrets. She did not offer it to Caleb first. She held it out to Ayanna with the quiet of a thing that had outlived danger. The pages were cramped with pencil lines, names and charcoal scratches. Small crosses marked places. Some pages had little maps, rough as anyone might scratch in the dirt with a twig. Caleb caught, half hidden between the lines, a name he had seen on a ragtag list once, when he'd been scribbling offers on a battlefield manifest. Families, settlements, the notation of supply runs that had never returned. Ayanna's face went still. She took the notebook and read through it, as if she were threading a needle. She did not look at Caleb when she said, "You did not buy a woman, stranger. You set down a purse like a man offering help, and for that you will answer." Caleb thought for a second she would ask them to leave. He had expected that. He had expected suspicion and perhaps hunting. He had not expected the soft steadiness in her voice that made his chest feel like a broken bell awaiting repair. "You will stay until we decide what is to be done," Ayanna told him. "You will not speak of this place. You will make yourself useful. And you will not claim what this woman has done as a tale of your making." Caleb had no argument for that. He nodded, the motion one of surrender and relief braided together. He had come west to run, and now he found himself unsettled by the idea that there might be a place that would not let him run. Ayanna listened without looking away from Kwanyama. She had a stiffness to the way she held herself that was not just from travel. It had the imprint of being measured and judged and found wanting. But in the fold of her fingers was the notebook. When words failed, the pages did not. She had written what she had seen, and the record sat between them like a piece of evidence no judge could ignore. The elder read her notebook with that quiet that strips lies of their clothes. "These graves," Kwanyama said at last, and the air contracted around the words, "are not recent, or rather, they have been made recent by hands that thought themselves safe in the dark." There was a long silence. In it, the canyon seemed to listen, the cliff faces holding their breath. Dakota's eyes hardened. He moved closer to the ledge where a group of others had gathered. Mika, a woman with a notch of white through her left eyebrow and a scar that made a map across her cheek. Nashoba, younger and wiry, who seemed to stand on coiled thing, less man than a spring taut and ready. Kiona and Yuma, both young and raw with anger like a bitter leaf. Caleb felt suddenly the old soldier's calculus kick in, the moment when numbers and risk and human lives braided into a plan that could be enacted by those who could do it. He had been a captain once, ordered to hold a line with men who trusted him. He had been willing to follow commands then, and he had been equally willing to run when orders turned rotten. He did not know whether he could be trusted now, had no claim for absolution other than the act that had burned his last coin. But he had hands that could teach others how to hold a rifle. He had a head that could plan a flank, a knowledge of timing and smoke and the small grace of when to pull back. "If there are graves," he said, and his voice sounded like gravel thawing, "we can mark them. We can make witnesses out of those bones. If someone did this, there will be records, men who moved goods. There's always ink that betrays a hand." Kwanyama looked at him as if weighing the worth of a man's gait. "You offer words," she said. "We need work." The canyon did not answer with immediate action. There were ritual things to be done when danger arrived. The elders convened, the wounds were tended, and the ash of burned cabins was sifted for names that could be used for proof. Ayanna's notebook contained not merely crosses and maps, but small notes, dates written in pencil, notations of guards seen near ridges, the way the miners' carts ran along a stony bed and where they left their hungry tracks. She had a shorthand for people's faces, a notch to indicate men who wore Hale's crest, a dot for those who were younger and might be persuaded. When she spoke, she did so softly. "They took them at dawn," she said, "things arranged in the precise order trauma makes remember. They took the families from the lowlands. They said it was for work. Then they packed them to the mine. The men who came back were fewer in number. They left tools. They left only silence." No one in the canyon smiled at the phrasing. Silence in these parts was a currency as heavy as coin. Dakota asked her then, blunt as a spear, "How sure are you?" He did not hide the hard edge in his voice. He had watched his grandfather manufacture patience like a shield, and he had learned to ask for the cost up front. Ayanna opened the notebook to a page where she had drawn a symbol like a little grave with a notch. Her hands trembled as she traced it. "I counted names," she said. "I hid notes in the seams of the tents where they took the people. They would not have thought to look. I wrote the names as they were taken. If you follow those markers, you will find the ground that covers them." Kwanyama's face moved through the longitudes of feeling. First the cool assessment of a leader, then the softening that comes when a person sees the shape of truth. "Then we will verify," she said. "We will go in such small numbers as to be a whisper. We go only to see and to bring back the marks. If the land remembers the taking, it will remember the tracks." There were practicalities. Hale's men were not merely robbers with rifles. They held town halls, they bribed constables, they signed deeds with an ink that had the weight of law behind it. Hale's power was a net thrown over every ledger and saloon and sheriff's desk. There would be force in the form of men with pistols and money to hire eyes. There would be the complicity of those who preferred a clean profit to a moral weight. That did not stop the canyon from preparing. If anything, it sharpened their resolve. They had been pushed to the margins for long enough. The knowledge of graves changed the parameters of what they would accept. Caleb watched them prepare. He watched Neshoba pack rope and place a small metal cylinder in his belt, something that clinked like a promise and smelled faintly of sulfur. He watched Mika check the teeth of a rifle with the methodical care of someone who had loved a tool enough to trust it with her life. He watched Kiona and Yuma trade the quick humor of young fighters, a flinty exchange that made the air between them snap like small wires. At night, the canyon held its own council. Kwanyama sat at the center, with a woven cloth across her knees and the notebook spread like a map of sorrow. She listened while others argued the merits of flight versus fight. The older men who had seen trade routes and pacts spoke of legal routes. Ride to the territorial capital, find a lawyer, get indictments. The younger ones, who had not lived long enough to feel the sluggishness of courts, spoke of ambush and fire, and quick justice. Caleb had a flash of the town courtrooms he had once witnessed, the weird and slow legalese stacked like cordwood, the way a man with a brave speech could leave with nothing but a bruised throat and a docket. He thought of Hale's bench, the way the auction had felt like law itself. He knew, barely, as a man who had seen armies lose to paperwork more often than to bullets, that law could be a tool, but it was a tool that required proof, time, and men willing to stand by testimony when threats came. Ayanna's eyes met his then, under the low light of a single lamp. There was an understanding in them that made the canyon feel like an oven, the knowledge that both paths were dangerous and that both would be necessary. "They bury people to bury truth," she said. "If we let graves be the only proof, they bury the evidence and we bury the hope." Kwanyama decided they would do both. A small party would verify the graves and bring back names and tokens, while others would ride to the capital to seek counsel. It was a plan born of double hands, of minds that could bend to law and fists that could meet violence. Caleb felt the knot in his throat loosen, not from relief but from the weight of a choice finally made for him. He would not run. Before daylight they left, moving like ghosts between canyon walls. The world seemed to hold its breath for them. Caleb felt the dry wind on his face and the burn of an old wound, as if this canyon's wind had summoned dust from a battlefield long ago. He had not been a man who believed in simple penance. The thought of staying here and helping felt dangerous and true in a single sweet way. He had one hand on a rifle butt, like a tether to a person who might yet be useful. They crept toward the lowland where the mine's carts had left tracks. The country changed, scrub turned to hard-packed soil, and the air carried a mineral tang. They found the first markers easily. A ruined shanty, a burned piece of fabric caught on a tumbleweed, a child's shoe half buried with ankle, turned toward the sky like a small accusation. The earth here held a stillness that was different from the canyon's living hush. It was a muted holding, as if the ground had swallowed its breath and would not exhale. Ayanna knelt by a patch of ground and brushed away with the back of her hand, small motions, like a woman taking a photograph with touch. Under the dirt, a remnant of a wooden tag peeked out, something that had been used to label people for work parties, a crude inventory of lives. Her fingers trembled. The notebook folded open on her knee had a name in pencil, Lhasa. She whispered it, and then wrote an additional note with a bark of her teeth as she pressed the pencil to paper. The sight of the first marked grave made something in Dakota's jaw lose its tightness. He had been distant until then. Now he put his hand over Ayanna's and said nothing, but the touch was an ally in a new war, grief that did not remain private, but became a banner for the living. When they returned, the canyon gathered them in like a tide. Kwanyama set aside cloths and began to tie small strips to poles, tongues of cloth that would speak names at the sight, names that could not be silenced with a shovel. It was not spectacle, it was memory, and in that act lay resistance. If Hale thought he could discard bodies without consequence, he had miscounted the community's capacity for remembrance. That night there was a faint sound in the dark, a single horse's footfall at the ridge. Caleb pushed himself up, rifle in hand, and went to the watch. There was nothing at the ridge but a silhouette that melted like smoke into the stars. It might have been a false lead. It might have been Hale's men riding to scout. It might simply have been a wild horse. The canyon slept on edge. Caleb lay awake more than he had in years. His mind unfolded a series of small images, the auction wood and the coin's bright ring, the cabin's roof caving to flame. Ayanna's hand closed around the notebook. He saw himself at a crossroads he had been running toward for months, keep walking until the road was a line, and his past a map he never reopened, or stand and try to mend what could be mended by those with hands enough to try. He thought of the silver, the way it had fallen from his fist. He thought of the small feel of it as it sang into wood. The coin would not undo any harm. It had, however, bought him the only thing he had found that mattered at the edge of his life. Another's life entrusted to him. That choice was a transgression and a salvation wound in the same motion. In the morning, Kwanyama called a council where she gathered the elders and a handful of the canyon's fighters. A map, roughly drawn, lay on a flattened stone. The notebook lay beside it like a talisman and a threat. Caleb sat with his hands folded and watched how the others spoke. There was no romantic rhetoric here. The talk was of routes, of scouts, of how to move without leaving the canyon exposed. They made lists. Men who would ride to the capital, those who would go to the grave sites, those who would stand ready at the canyon mouth. Caleb listened, and then offered what he could. Training, timetables, a plan to filch munitions from a depot outside Hale's territory. It had the ring of danger even saying it aloud. Kwanyama lifted an eyebrow at him, approval mixed with caution. She liked the usefulness of a man with experience, but she had no taste for a whitewashed savior. He had to learn to be a member of the community, not its commander. Ayanna, for her part, refused to be merely the object of rescue. She spoke in the council with the bluntness of someone who had lived by survival and had pressed her ear against the world to hear where the ground cried out. She offered place names and dates and a short list of men who had come and gone with Hale's sigil on their chests. She spoke without melodrama, and that made the room lean closer. Kwanyama's face moved in a passing shadow, of sorrow for the names, but also of respect for the girl with the notebook who had kept the ledger of stolen lives. The decision they made in that canyon was not quick. It was not the romantic instant that turns drifters into heroes. It was measured, like laying a foundation. They would gather evidence and try the law. They would also prepare to strike if necessary. They would keep both hands ready, one for the ledger and one for the rifle. The legal road would be long and crooked. The violence road would cost them dearly. But neither road, Kwanyama said, allowed them to bury their heads in the ground like ostriches and pretend their silence was safety. Caleb felt something like gratitude begin to grow, a plant that did not know whether it would bloom. He had expected to stay one night and leave with the barest of consciences polished. Instead, he found himself involved in preparation, sharpening not just blade but purpose. He spent the day showing Dakota and Neshoba the way to handle a rifle, the care of a scope, how cautious movement kept a man alive. He found he could teach them to move quietly and hold breath at reflex. He did not boast. There was no talk of past honors, just the transferal of small useful knowledge. As dusk fell, the canyon hummed with a different kind of industry. Men and women who had not held arms in organized fashion put leather to leather, stacking bullets and cleaning barrels. The scabbed ridge where Caleb's old life had been lay like a scar he could not erase, but he felt himself suture to something new, threads of labor and trust. The bag of silver he had emptied was a bright memory at the bottom of a long road. Its sound still lingered in his head as a motif of the choice that had started everything. There was tenderness, too, in furtive and private moments. Dakota, who had held himself like a man ready to be at war with the world, sat by the river and listened while Ayanna said a name out loud and let its shape float into the wind. Kwanyama taught a younger woman how to stitch a wound, showing the exact turn of needle that did not close too tight. Caleb watched these small ministrations and felt, for the first time in a long while, the worth of a life measured by daily acts rather than battlefield headlines. But there were other sounds in the distance. Men's talk carried on winds that knew how to find canyon mouths. The memory of the horse's hoof at the ridge had not left him. Hale's reach could extend like a stain. Hale would not accept loss quietly. The thought of confrontation made Caleb feel the old war in his bones, and with it the knowledge that any raid, any attempt at justice, would cost people living things. Names that would be marked no longer in a notebook, but in the stone of a canyon with flowers and hands to remember them. Late that night, when the fire had ebbed to coals, and most of the canyon slept in a weary sort of slumber, Kwanyama found Caleb by the outer ledge. She held the notebook like a child holds a secret. "You did not have to buy her," she said to him. It was not a question. It was a fact stated like a ledger entry. You could have walked past and told yourself you had done what you could. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I used up what I had," he said. "That is not enough for what it bought me." Kwanyama looked at him with the kind of simplicity that was never simple. "There will be cost," she said. "There will be names that cannot come back, and a trial that will take trade and patience. Redemption is not a box you check with money. It is a road you walk with others." He thought of the silver and the way it had sounded, the way it had changed the math of a room. He thought of his hands, which had been used for taking, and now were learning to give. "I will walk," he said. "You will do more than that," she replied. "You will bind wounds while you build a case. You will teach the boys to hold a rifle and the elders to hold the law. You will not make yourself the story's spine. You will be a plank in the thing we raise." He swallowed. He had not known how to be less than the center. Now, in the dim light, as mountain wind swept the embers, he felt the narrowness of his life expand in a way that was both terrifying and steadying. He agreed without drama. The canyon, for all its quiet, is not a place free of watchers. When they set out early the next morning to the last markers, the place Ayanna had indicated as a cluster of shallow pits hidden under a moon-baked field, they found evidence that someone else had been there since. Footprints, a ragged scrap of cloth notched with a name, a metal token, stamped with a miner's mark, shoved as if to mimic the workman's forgetfulness. It was an act of tampering that felt like a promise. We will not be allowed to do this work in peace. They moved back like a field under surveillance, and that night the canyon was murmuring with the quiet of a place that had accepted the impossibility of surprise. It would take cunning to pull off the things they needed. It would take cunning and courage and sacrifice. The thought of sacrifice settled into the group like a second skin. No one spoke of it openly, but in the way Mika checked the fit of a belt and Nashoba clenched his jaw as he examined the small metal cylinder again, they acknowledged the cost. Caleb lay awake then, counting silhouettes, and he found again the bag of silver like a repeated phrase in his chest. He thought of how he had paid that money, and how, in doing so, he had put himself into the current of other lives. He thought of justice, of the law, and of those small seams where human actions become stories remembered, and those other seams where they become buried. As dawn teased the canyon's rim, a rider approached the rise, not a scout but a messenger, a trim man from the neighboring valley who moved like someone who knew what secret news meant. Trouble. He handed Ayanna a folded paper, a ledger she read with the quick attention of someone who had learned to read the world by lines. She looked at Caleb then, and the smallness of a private decision burst outward into consequence. "They sent men to the depot," she said, and the canyon's air changed. "Hale is organizing. He moves faster than his visibility suggests." Caleb felt the old calculation reassert itself. Risk versus gain. The notebook on Ayanna's lap caught the morning light, and for a second he saw the coins glint in its reflection. He had paid silver to buy a woman into a place where she might breathe. That action had set chains of movement into motion. There was no unspooling what had been done. There was only the work ahead. And in that instant, the canyon was no longer merely a refuge. It was a community on the brink of a step that would either save them in the long run or cost them dearly in the short. The choice would be theirs, and at the center of that choice was a man with a coat and a memory and the faint, steady sound of silver that would never fail to remind him why he had come. If this moment finds you, if the thought of standing when others sell people in their name strikes a chord, hit like and tell where you're watching from. It matters to know how many will answer a call when a town makes trade of another's body. They spent the day like hands at work. A small party was chosen to ride for the capital. Ayanna would not go, but Dakota would lead 2.5. Nashoba, lean and bright with eagerness. Mika, solid as a rock with a rifle across her lap. And Caleb, who thought perhaps he had earned no place at a council table, but had earned callous enough for the road ahead. The rest would ready the canyon and the raid. They would steal a cache from a supply depot off the old road if they could, and would prepare small explosives. Nashoba's metal cylinder was part of that plan, an instrument of destruction designed to counter a fortified defensive post. There was no relish in the idea. There was only the stark arithmetic of force, and the hard lesson that sometimes the only way to hold law in place long enough to work was to cut down the muscle that protected law's enemies. They left at dusk. Caleb could see the ridgelines like black teeth against the sky. His saddle creaked. The wind tugged at the brim of his hat like an impatient hand. Nashoba rode near him in the dark and talked in bursts, about the thrill of fire and the fear of being the one who set it. Caleb listened, and in the listening he felt an old thing he had known. To lead is to be responsible for the fear of those who follow. They rode under a moon that had the look of a pallid coin in the sky. The road to the depot snaked like a vein. The world smelled of cold iron. When they crested the last rise before the depot, light spilled like a wound from the windows of a guardhouse. Hale's men were not mere brutes. They kept watch and they kept records, and they dressed their brutality in the veneer of a company that knew how to sign a paper with a quill and bless itself in the next breath. Caleb dismounted and crouched in the scrub with Nashoba and Mika. They moved like three shadows stitched to the edges of each other. The depot sat like a fat beast, boxes stacked, a small lot of crates marked for shipment to distant posts. Beyond, the rails curved, and the miners' carts lay in a thin, rusting row. Nashoba's cylinder felt like a lie small and certain on Caleb's hip. He knew the man who would use it, thin-lipped and young, brave in a way that had been welded by lack of choice. Caleb had a private, ugly fear that in the act of striking they would pay for what they sought with the blood of those who had not asked to die. He also had a quiet, rising conviction that if they did not act, they would be complicit in letting graves be the only record of their kin. They moved in with the practiced slowness that comes from living by the idea that speed is for the unprepared. They slipped to the gate where a single guard slouched, watchful but lazy. Mika knocked him down with the kind of swift, decisive motion that made violence look tidy when it would never be tidy again. They cut him free of his weapon and left him bound to the wood. It was a small mercy and a shrewd move. Inside, crates were broken and weapons taken. Clemency was not on the list. A short, efficient theft of armaments felt both like theft and like the rebalancing of scales. Each bullet taken had a name now, a person whose life might be protected by this act. They loaded what they could carry and eased away under a sky that seemed to hold its breath again, this time not in anticipation, but in waiting. They returned without fanfare, and the canyon welcomed them with cupped hands and wary faces. Logistics were checked, weapons cooled, plans were set in lines as careful as stitches. There was no victory in it. There was only the hard comfort of taking one step toward a math that might equate to justice. That night, Caleb sat by the river and looked at the notebook that had started them on this path. He had no illusions that what they were doing would erase the past. He had no hope that the law would move quickly enough to prevent more ruin. What he had was the small, steadying knowledge that he had stopped running. In the place of escape was work. Ayanna watched him, as if she could see the edges where his redemption was being stitched. She came and sat without asking. "You have given silver," she said simply. "What you give now will not be coin." Caleb let the sound of the water be his. Caleb let the sound of the water be his tether, and the night its slow metronome. He felt Ayanna's presence like a hand on the back of his neck, steady, patient, and when she spoke, it was as if she were naming a thing to be made real by simply saying it. "What you give now will be work, Rourke," she said, "not coin. Work that holds other work." He nodded. There was a small, stubborn muscle in his face that had learned to answer with action rather than words. He walked the rim of the canyon then, listening to the scrambling calls of distant coyotes, feeling the roughness of a life he had once hoped to leave behind settle into him like a new skin. Beside him, the notebook slept in Ayanna's pack, wrapped in oilcloth. He thought about that folded leather and the soft scrape of pencil, how dangerous such small objects could be when they named what powerful men preferred to forget. They moved after dawn. The canyon was a hive of quiet industry. Children cupped water in tin cups and passed them to men whose hands smelled of gun oil and grief. Old women stitched bandages and lists at the same time. The work of living had a softness to it that could be mistaken for ordinary days. It was an armor none of them flaunted, only wore. Caleb trained. He taught posture, breath control, the discipline of not pulling the trigger until the target was stationary in your mind. He taught less of the killing and more of the measurements, the distance that separated life from loss, the fold of a coat that could hide a pistol, the way a shadow suggested a flank. He showed Neshoba how to set a small charge correctly, how to mask scent and timing for a blast meant to cripple wood rather than people. Neshoba listened with the single-minded hunger of someone who had seen no future other than the quick satisfaction of violence. Caleb tried to graft that hunger to purpose. The depot raid had emboldened them more than its haul of rifles. It proved two things, that Hale's networks could be touched and that the canyon's people, when given tools and a plan, could make something like power. It also showed them the cost. The raid had left a guard beaten and humiliated. They had learned how thin the line was between a tidy theft and spilling blood. That knowledge kept them careful. Ayanna called a second council once the weapons were accounted and the mine's routes mapped from Ayanna's notes and Chandler's, an old ledger found in a locked crate from the depot that hinted at shipments and sign-offs. They could not, she said, simply march and shoot. There needed to be a way to make Hale's deeds undeniable beyond the telling of a woman with a notebook. Hale's power was not only his brawn, it was the ink on deeds, the certificates in town registers, the men in the capital who answered to his purse. If they were to strip his impunity, they would need both bodies and paperwork. So they did what the land taught them to do. They used two hands. Men rode for the capital, Caleb, Dakota, Kwanyama's eldest niece Malia, and a smaller guard led by Neshoba in one of his sharper, more reckless moments, though Kwanyama would not go herself. They moved slow, keeping to ridgelines and night trails. Ayanna refused to ride in a carriage fit for a woman's show of gentle rescue. She walked where the ground was soft and took the heat of the sun as if it could prove anything. She carried with her the notebooks she had kept. Names, maps, times, a shorthand of theft. The capital was a sun-blunted place of red bricks and town halls. It smelled of ink and stale tobacco, and the sorts of speeches that were said with clean hands. Samuel Pierce met them at the courthouse steps with his hat in hand, and a face that had not seen much sleep, but had seen the inside of more dockets than most of the men in Hale's orbit. He was lean, quick, the kind of lawyer who believed in the power of a single fact laid across a judge's desk. Caleb had expected a man polished by earthly law. He found someone whose jaw tightened when he spoke of wronged people, and who did not flinch at uncompromising truth. "They'll try to dismiss you as rabble," Pierce said softly in the corridor, where drafts made the candles sway. "We need more than pain and grief. We need names, we need dates, we need documents that tie Hale's company to the mines and to those who died. We need, to make them tremble, paper that bears a signature." "That's what she has," Kwanyama replied without flourish. "It is not the sort of paper you keep in your house, but it names names." Ayanna handed the first notebook to Pierce. His fingers, trained in civility, turned the pages like a judge reading a list of offenses. He called them evidence in a low voice that made the word feel like a tool rather than a claim. He asked for copies to be made. He asked for a moment to breathe and think and lay a plan. Marshal Clayton came next, a large man with a face the color of old ash, and a moral straightforwardness that was almost shocking in its clarity. He had been a constable once in the capital, and had not forgotten how corruptible the post could be. He pledged quietly to each of them that he had men who would swear to protect witnesses, that he would see to it that subpoenas were delivered, that he could stand in courthouse lobbies and make pressure with the bluntness of badge and name. That was the legal half. The Canyon did not leave their home undefended during the trial preparations. Caleb returned with a smaller party and a pack of printed copies of Ayanna's notebook. They took the slow road back, watching the sky for Hale's riders. Along the way, they picked up the first hints of reprisal. A small homestead burned not far from the scrub where they had pressed. A cart overturned. A scarecrow impaled with a message. Hale's mark carved as a promise. The trial began not with trumpets, but with the slow, grinding weight of motions. Pierce moved first for an injunction to search the mine's ledgers and to seize certain crates from Hale's offices pending the hearing. Hale's men, now called the defense, filed counter-motions, insisted the Canyon's people were conspirators of vague, dangerous vagabondry, and argued the notebooks were the product of misremembered names. There were challenges about jurisdiction and arguments that Hale's operations were private enterprise, beyond the reach of a local court. The law room smelled of paper and sweat. Witness intimidation arrived like rain. A man who had agreed to testify against a foreman's violence found his barn torched. A woman cashiered at the supply depot received a late-night knock and found the cellar empty the next morning. There were threatening notes slipped under doors. Marshal Clayton was never out of sight when a witness left the courthouse, and for that the court's clerk would sigh with both gratitude and the knowledge of how little the shield meant when money talked. Samuel Pierce pushed forward anyway, filing affidavits, arranging depositions, pressing for evidence. He sent teams to the mine to check ledgers. He wrote formal requests for cross-examination and subpoenas. Caleb did not sit at the court the whole time. He worked in the canyon, healing, training, and making sure that their home could hold the blows. He taught the people to secure their records, to copy the notebooks and bury the original where only a few knew. He tied up a rule of men's behavior with the kind of blunt gospel he knew: fight so that those who remain might live. He watched the canyon's women stitch defense lines that were more than cloth: safe houses, signal fires, places to move witnesses should a threat become real. Then hail struck, not on paper, but in the way the hungry strike, swift, furious, trying to break the body that a community had begun to raise. It came at dawn when the canyon was thinly held, a herd of men moving like a shadow with the sun against them, so that their faces were black. They came with shotguns and a brass certainty that their rightful owners had been wronged of nothing. The canyon's alarms were raised by a scout on the ridge who had seen smoke and the glint of a rider's metals. Caleb felt his heart go hard in his chest, the old war rising like a remembered tide. They met in the wash below the mouth, the men of Hale pushing forward with confidence. There were whispers of gunfire, the sharp smell of burnt powder crossing the air, the sound of bodies colliding with earth. The canyon's people had not wanted to fight a pitched battle, but they had prepared lines and traps. Neshoba, who had been less a pupil than a kind of willing flame, took his station where the path narrowed, made for the kind of small and desperate thing that could stop a larger machine. He moved with a clarity that had been absent in him before. A kind of single note struck true. The plan was simple cruelty: hamper them, lure them deeper, and cut their retreat. Neshoba's cylinder, small, crude, but honed by the hand of him who set it, was meant to tear a wooden stockade that Hale's men might use to shelter. It would not be a broad strike. It would be a means to bend wood and mind. Neshoba checked the fuse like a man checking his own pulse. He looked at Caleb then and nodded with a grin that was not foolish, but hollowed with an acceptance of a price to be paid. "Make it count," Caleb said, because there was nothing else to say. No sermon could cushion a man who was about to make himself the hinge of an entire fight. Neshoba's charge did make it count. He slid the cylinder into a hidden pit, and when the moment came, he set the match. The blast took the air like the tearing of a cloth curtain. The stockade exploded inward. Men fell. Wood became splinter and bone sound, and the canyon took in a breath as if startled awake. The loss was immediate and cruel. Neshoba's body did not rise from the smoke. He had torn himself into the fight, and left a hole that none of them later tried to fill with words. There was silence heavy enough to be a presence itself later, when the dust settled and the smoke had thinned. In the chaos, Caleb felt the old soldier's reflex take over: assess, move, take the point where a hole formed. Mika took up a line and covered flanks. Dakota, whose trust had been a slow manufacture, showed the hard thing of a man in the moment. He fought with a brutal, precise intensity that suggested not just rage, but a long-stored grievance being finally let loose. Hale's men fought like men who believed the law was on their side. They had not counted on the canyon's resolve. The real collision came when Hale himself stalked into view on the flank of a small hill, a man who had never known what being challenged meant until that morning. He wore his certainty like armor, and his men rallied around him. He carried a pistol like a crown. Dakota met him in the narrow. 2 men, 2 histories compressed into a single space. Their fight was a thing of closeness and carving. Dirt shifted under boot, and the sun caught the sweat on their faces. Caleb did not see the first blow. He felt it afterward, like a change in the wind's meaning. Dakota's hand found Hale's throat in a surge of necessary violence. There was no long speech, no moral flourish. Dakota drove him back against broken rock, and there, with the canyon listening like a jury, he ended what needed ending. It was not the elegant revenge of a storybook. It was the raw, unvarnished closing of a wound. Hale's body fell like a ruined argument. In the moment after, silence stepped in, huge and unwieldy, the second silence the canyon would enshrine. They won the field, but not without cost. Kiona and Yuma, bright and eager, were taken as the fight rolled through the red dust. They bled in ways that could not be swiftly stitched. Their voices grew quiet and then still. Mika, calmed by the iron of her competence, held both of them as they left the world of loud living and entered the quieter one where names were remembered instead of plans. Nashoba was gone. The canyon numbered names and found too many missing. After the battle, everyone moved like people with their hands full of shock. Bodies were covered, and Kwanyama and the elders performed the small acts of care, washing a wound, wrapping a dead hand with cloth, binding a thigh. They said names aloud, as if that pronouncing could keep them from becoming only numbers later. There was no triumph in the way they spoke. There was a heavy gratitude edged with grief. The notebook was gone in the initial melee, snatched by a man who had seen its value. But it was found later, emptied from a dead rider's pockets, pages ruffled, a fold torn, but every single line intact. It was as if the thing itself had been determined to survive. Caleb walked among the fallen and felt his own edges sharpen and dull in turn. He had bought a life with silver and had bled to keep the others. He caught himself thinking in textures once more, the give of fabric when someone took a fell blow, the tack of blood on a palm. When he found Ayanna, she was still, kneeling by Nashoba's body and tracing the face like a woman reading a poem. She did not scream. She did not sob loudly. She whispered a line of names into the wind, and when she did, it sounded less like grief and more like oath. They retrieved evidence from Hale's man, pouches of letters, a ledger heavy with ink that showed where bodies had been traded for work tickets, receipts that named the families and the supposed dates of labor. There were also things they had not expected. A small locked box taken from Hale's saddlebag, its contents a series of blurred photographs and a roll of stamped papers, deeds and receipts tied to the land the mine had taken. Ayanna's notebook, found turned and muddy but legible, had the names that matched those receipts. Together, with Chandler's ledger and the crate records from the depot, Samuel Pierce began to draw the line from Hale's private violence to his legal claims. Signatures, bonds, and receipts that sprawled like a map of guilt. The ride to the capital after the battle was slower. They carried what had to be carried and left the rest in the hands of the canyon's people. Kwanyama refused to leave her elders and the women who mended those left standing. But she sent a few with them, Malia and another elder's son, who could swear to the names with solemnity. Marshal Clayton rode with them partway, then left a ring of his own men around their path into town. They arrived to find that Samuel Pierce had already started to move the machinery of law, the filing of indictments against those who had aided Hale, applications for orders to seize mine assets, requests for depositions of men who had signed off on payrolls. The court moved with the clumsy righteousness of an instrument called into service. Trial did not proceed as a clean arc from accusation to consequence. It progressed like a river through rocks. The defense tried every stall it could. They argued that Hale's men had been provoked, that the canyon had attacked first, that the notebooks were forgeries of a vengeful people. There were motions, battles fought in legal language. Witnesses were called and called again. Ayanna testified, and when she took the stand, she did not perform the victim nor the saint. She spoke like a ledger. Names, dates, observations, small marks she had made and where she had hidden them. She answered where she could not, and where someone fought to discredit her, she looked at them with such clarity that the courtroom felt stripped. Kwanyama traveled from the canyon and gave an elder's testimony about the graves, describing in calm, practiced speech the places the young had pointed to and the signs of tampering after Hale's men had come. There was ugliness. Men hired to shout outside the courthouse and to whisper threats at witnesses attempted to cast doubt. A juror received a note that made his hands tremble. A county official admitted under questioning that he had accepted Hale's coin for a small favor. Samuel Pierce pressed every advantage. He subpoenaed ledgers, produced the depot records, and cross-examined a foreman whose memory faltered under the pressure of paper and oath. Marshal Clayton shepherded witnesses, and at one hearing he physically stood between a witness and a group of men who glared like wolves. He placed himself where threats could not proceed unnoticed. He leaned once on Samuel Pierce in a corridor and said plainly, "We can keep them safe inside these walls. We can't keep them safe out there. We will have to be willing to do more than paper sometimes." The press of days wore everyone thin. The canyon sent people to testify, to swear to names, to show that those graves had been made, that people had been taken for work and never returned. The defense came with a factory of excuses, false leads, fake signatures they said had been forged. But the trail of paper, once laid end to end, began to tell a story that could not be fully denied. Hale's accountants had been sloppy at times, leaving margins unchecked, dates misinterred. A clerk's ledger showed payments to men who wore Hale's mark, payments dated near the same days Ayanna had noted. A transport ticket matched a route whose last stop was the back entrance of the mine. These things, laid like pebbles on the judge's table, made a path. The trial turned heavy at the part where the defense tried to paint the canyon's people as criminals. Testimony from Kwanyama and Ayanna put that to rest. They were witnesses to theft, not perpetrators. Yet the court itself was a field of compromise. Some men were convicted. Hale's lieutenants who had taken orders and acted on them were found guilty of a variety of crimes: forced labor, conspiracy, murder in the second degree for those implicated in the grave sites. For others, the law found itself hamstrung where corners had been looted by money well spent. Some officials implicated in bribery were forced to resign. Others resigned with settlements that tasted of a grey moral calculus. The mine itself was ordered closed, pending a review that ended eventually in partial restitution. A band of land returned to those who could prove family ties. A portion fenced into a trust managed by a trustee appointed by the court and subject to oversight. The verdicts did not feel like loud vindication. They felt like a dampening of a fever, necessary but not healing. Families received word and held quiet ceremonies, placing cloth on poles and reeds as if each piece of fabric might hold the name like a bead. They buried their dead in the canyon and lined the graves with the small things that had been found: a child's shoe, a burned coin, a scrap of cloth. Someone carved a small wooden marker and nailed a coin, one of Caleb's old silver pieces, into the top of Neshoba's grave, not as payment, but as memory. The bag of silver that had bought Ayanna's freedom sat now in a small box in Caleb's cabin. He had kept one coin and given the rest to buy medicines and paper and to freelance the work of men who would testify. The coin, dented and worn, had become less an object of purchase and more of a reminder that choices shape more than lives. They set a course for the days that follow. Rebuilding began not with grand proclamations, but with slow labor. The mine's shuttered machinery rusted in the sun, while men from the canyon and nearby settlements moved to reclaim what they could. A small parcel of land, enough for a handful of families, was returned. The rest would be the subject of years-long dispute. That did not stop the canyon from using what little they had to plant, to re-roof homes, and to teach children to read the names that had once been dug into the dirt. Caleb stayed. He learned the long arc of paperwork and the slow art of patience. He taught, wood by wood, the rebuilding of barns and the making of fences that could protect a small field. He did not transform into a saint overnight. He was a man with a past he could not wash away. He stayed because the living work of doing right, of tangibly making a place safer, was itself a kind of redemption he could believe in. There were quiet dangers afterward. A few hired hands of Hale's tried to make trouble, stone thrown through windows, threats scribbled on doors. Prosecutors in the capital moved to cleave off parts of the company into safe pockets, and some men who had worn Hale's mark walked off into other towns. The law had crippled the machine but not slain it entirely. Pierce took it in stride. He argued in chambers about injunctions, he wrote letters, he pressed for oversight committees. He insisted on the appointment of a special investigator who produced a report that would be read for years as proof that the system could, if pressed, expose its own rot. Ayanna did not become a public figure, but she was a cornerstone. She trained others in keeping records, in the tiny discipline of census and naming that would make it harder for powerful men to erase names in a ledger. Dakota became a leader of the young men, no longer simply a fighter, but a man who could hold a council and decide where use of force was moral and where it was not. Ayanna stayed as the community's spine, dispensing decision and sorrow in equal measure. She insisted on ceremonies that made grief into obligation. Each year, the canyon would gather to read aloud the names of the lost and to place a piece of cloth upon a pole. The ritual made grief into law. It made forgetting a dishonor. Caleb's redemption did not arrive as trumpet or as forgiveness from a god. It arrived by measure, in the faces of children who had their first meal in months, in the way Mika taught a group to clean a rifle with gentleness and respect rather than as an instrument of death, in the way he mended a roof and found hands greeted by others instead of having to find his own way alone. He took to carting water and splitting wood, and more dangerously, to teaching. He taught men to lift less like a brute and more like someone who might return home. There were nights he still woke to the taste of cordite on his tongue and the memory of a man's face eaten by powder. He had nightmares of the auction block, of Hale's smile, of the bag of silver clinking like a bell. But in the daylight he found a discipline that steadied him, a child's laugh, the sound of a hand sewing a patch, the sight of a field planted with corn. He learned to be present in the smaller things, feeding a baby, reading a ledger, tending a grave. The community's trust did not come all at once. It arrived in increments, a shared meal, a watched harvest, a night when a rider returned. Years passed in the manner of work. The mine's shuttered buildings sagged, bats nested in broken beams. A small committee, formed from canyon representatives and lawyers appointed by the court, negotiated a trust to oversee the returned land. They had to fight in hearing rooms and behind tables and at the public level to keep the mine from being bought out by other interests. They had to argue for water rights, for crop rotation, for schooling. They won some things, lost others. The law had done enough to make Hale's name a cautionary tale rather than a continued command. One late autumn, when the light had the thin gold of a coin tossed into a bowl, the community gathered to raise a small building, a hall for meetings, and a place to hold the notebooks and artifacts that had been used in court. Ayanna presided, and the elders read names aloud. They placed a piece of Nashoba's cloth on the hall's cornerstone, and the wooden beams still smelled faintly of smoke. Caleb stood at the edge of the circle, his hands roughened not by soldiering alone, but by the new tasks of building. He felt the weight of the bag of silver in his pocket, a coin he had somehow kept and polished in secret. It was the only piece he had not given away. He took it out now and pressed it into the palm of a young boy whose father had died in the battle. It was not a payment. It was an offering of story. This is the thing that started things. You keep it, Caleb said, not so you can buy anything with it, but so you know that one small act can move the world. The boy looked at the coin as if he had never seen such a thing, then shrugged and hid it away under his shirt like a secret. Caleb felt something in his own chest settle, as if the coin's weight had shifted from a purchase to a pledge. The canyon, over time, turned its wounds into a form of memory that midwifed resilience. They taught children how to find names in ledgers, how to read maps, how to hold law with as much care as a rifle. They set their dead in a row on a small hill overlooking the channel where life moved like a steady ribbon. Ayanna planted saplings along the graves, trees that would mark seasons rather than erase them. On the anniversary of the battle, they gathered the way Ayanna had taught them to gather, quietly, with minutes of silence that spread like a soft hand across the crowd. There had been 3 moments of silence in the canyon that everyone carried in their bones. The night the cabin burned, the hour after Neshoba's sacrifice, and the verdict when the court finally called names and handed down partial justice. Those silences acted like a bell, each one rung the name of a thing done and not to be forgotten. They spoke little and moved with light steps, placing cloth and marking with simple tools what would be remembered. Caleb listened to the names read and could feel the slow uncoiling of something that had once been coiled tight with guilt. He thought of the bag of silver and the way a money sound had started a chain. That chain had led him, painfully and often by error, to a place he would not leave. He had come west to run. He remained because he had found reason to stay. Later that afternoon, he sat with Ayanna by the river, where the water cut slow and patient through stone. Children splashed in the shallows, and a woman sang a low, repair-like song as she mended a net. Ayanna had grown into a leader, both quiet and firm. She had kept records, taught others how to keep them, and had become the person many in the canyon turned to when they needed someone to speak straight and true. She looked at Caleb. Sunlight slid along her cheekbones and made the river behind her spill like bright cloth. "You paid with silver once," she said in a voice that made no accusation, only stated a fact as if it were a coordinate on a map. "You pay now with time, and time is harder." Caleb let his face sun for a second, letting old scars show where the light sliced. "I always figured time would be easier than coin," he said dryly. "Never thought I'd be wrong." She laughed, small and quick. "That was your lesson," she said, "hard learned." They sat in companionable silence then, the kind that does not need to be filled. The canyon hummed with life, the slow creak of a cart, the laughter of a child who found a stone shaped like a heart. The hall on the ridge had a new roof. There were plows stored in a shed, and a small garden showed green in rows that promised harvest. When the evening came, Caleb walked to his cabin and took the old bag of silver from its hiding place. It was light now. He had spent most of it buying medicines and paper and paying for the work of men who needed a wage as much as any other. He set the single coin on the windowsill and watched the room shrink around it like a small world. He thought about the auction block in Red Hollow, the way he had laid the bag down as if it could buy the world's debts. He thought about the long road that followed and the lives that had been marked by that single reckless act. He did not pretend the act had been noble. It had been transgressive, rash, and inadequate, but it had set a motion in the universe that made others stand up. In the end, redemption had not been given to him. It had been made every day by people who chose to keep a place from falling apart. He dusted the coin and placed it in his palm, feeling its weight finally as a thing that could remind him to keep working. When night fell, the canyon did not quiet into a lullaby, but rather into a steady breathing, the sound of people who had survived enough to rebuild. Caleb stepped outside and watched a child chase a moth across a patch of moonlight. In the far distance, a smith's hammer rang like a metronome of resilience. Kwanyama's silhouette stood on the ridge, small against the huge sweep of sky, and he lifted a hand to her, an acknowledgement of what she had given and what she had taught. He had started by buying a life with silver. He had been chased, burned, and forced to trade old habits for new responsibilities. He had been tested by law's slowness and violence's sharp cost. He had seen friends die, and he had buried them with names the law had finally, late and imperfectly, confirmed. He had watched courts convict some of the guilty and let others slide away like oil in water. He had watched the canyon stitch itself back together with hands that had something new to protect. When he finally lay down that night, the coin warm in his pocket, he did not imagine a life without the memory of cordite or the taste of grief. He imagined instead the long and steady work that would take the place he had been given and make of it a home. He thought of Neshoba's grin, of Ayanna's ledger, of Kwanyama's hands. He understood now that redemption was not a single act, but a habit, an everyday, faithful resistance against the ways men count one another as property. At dawn, he rose and walked to the small memorial where the names of the dead were read aloud. A child handed him a scrap of cloth to place on a new post. His fingers trembled just enough to feel the weight of the truth. What he had bought for a bag of silver had become, by sweat and law and loss, a community that would not be erased. If this story landed with something in you, if the idea that a single choice, costly and imperfect, can set a chain of better things in motion, matters to you, share it with someone who believes in small acts of courage. It is how we keep the ledger balanced, not with a single coin, but with a life given back every day.